Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Sloppy Lab. I'm JT Russell. This is Bottom of the Beaker, the weekly show about the design ducks. And oh my gosh, how long has it been? I'm already messing it up.
Been too long.
My co-host tonight is saying that it's been something like 3,457 interludes, but finally, quick draw, finally, we're back. Third season, same as the first, a little bit sloppier and a whole lot worse.
I didn't think I thought we'd be canceled by now. I mean, we made it longer than the Acolyte. Who knew?
You know what? They keep trying to shut us down, but they've been. This is their problem. They go after our sponsors, thinking that they can get our funding pulled. And little did they know, they are only increasing our power by deepening our pockets.
They with a capital T.
They with a capital T. Absolutely, absolutely. Well, welcome back to you folks in listener land, and welcome back, of course, Quick Draw. So glad to be back in the lab for regular episodes of Bottom of the Beaker again. Yeah.
Yeah. We always say when we do these interludes, we're gonna do a refresh, kind of like get some new ideas, maybe get some new tech. We have a beautiful new splash page that you kind of created during the interludes with some ducks and other things. And just to make sure that we were still the same group, we did have some technical difficulties starting tonight, so we are still Sloppy Lab work. No worries, it's the same crew here, just a different season.
That's right. So yeah, there's a non-zero chance that my audio will cut out for everybody except me. I don't know. And I'll just keep plowing on, and Quick Draw will scream at me into his chat. But unless he screams really loud, I won't hear coming all the way from Central PA.
Yeah, Central PA.
Eastern, Mid-Eastern. I don't know. I'm terrible with geography. What would you
Oh,
say?
wow. I mean, I'm very, very clearly Western PA.
I mean, well, everything was kind of west of where I was, I guess. I
Yeah,
don't know.
I used to, you know what? It's funny you say that because so I'm in Pittsburgh, and which is obviously Western PA.
Mhm.
Everything east of me, I consider Eastern PA, whether that's like Johnstown or Carlisle or Harrisburg or Philly or just outside of Philly, as all of my college friends used to say they were from. Which just outside of Philly, when you're in Pittsburgh and someone tells you that, it means anywhere else in the state, pretty much. So I kind of understand where you're coming from. Everything east of me, I just consider Eastern Pennsylvania.
Yeah. I mean, like I knew you were west of me, but it's like it kind of, yeah, exactly. Gets a little blurry, a little blurry. Like my geography from living in the Boston area was like, yeah, there's Boston itself, and then there's like 2 hours outside of Boston, and that's all of Massachusetts, and you're done.
That's it.
Yeah. So you have a similar thing going. You have a similar thing going for sure.
Yeah.
But enough sloppy geography. Easily my worst subject in school, by bar none, aside from languages. But except for those two, they were all great. I don't
Comments
know.
in the chat are good. New Jersey is Eastern PA. I agree with that. That sounds right to me.
Okay, okay. See, I don't know, lost on me because it could be. It could be. Though I have family in New Jersey. I don't know. We should just do the sloppy ultimate frisbee podcast. Quick draw. There are an awful
Hmm.
lot of discers in disc golfers, maybe mostly, but there was a wonderful disc golf tournament, beach disc golf tournament on the Jersey Shore that I went to every year for a longest time, and it was delightful, delightfully everything you'd imagine it is.
Well, I would
But
not be a part of the sloppy disc golf podcast. I am not a disc thrower of any sort.
mhm. Could we entice you if we started bidding chains on discs? Like
Absolutely. If there's a very, if I'm able to analyze the discs and determine which one's better, then I think that would be fair.
ooh, exactly. And the chat's got it right. The marketing does itself. The sloppy lab work. Disc golf Discord server. Oh my goodness, so good. I love it. But anyway, we've only begun. We've already digressed. It can only
Yeah.
go up from here. I don't know. We have a fun topic in store. I think a fun topic in store. Something that's been on my mind a decent amount in the interlude season, as it were. Simple question, I guess, with maybe a lot to unpack in it. So, what is the ideal length of a game of Keyforge in turns? And yeah, that's kind of what we're going to be hashing out today, this evening, this morning, wherever you happen to be. We have a little bit of data we can get into, very little bit of data we can get into. We put out a survey for some folks to get some quick hits on what kind of they felt. Gut check was a good length of a game, and also we did kind of some reflection on game logs and stats from our own records, so we can get into that too. But maybe a good place to start is kind of like, what do we even mean by ideal? Like, what it like? Is there such a thing as too short or too long? Like, what do we have to even be worried about here?
Yeah, I think it's intentionally vague, as you described it, I would say. And this is a question that you first posed probably sometime during the Winds of Exchange period, where we're trying to like try out good decks in Winds of Exchange, see what worked. And we had settled on a good deck in Winds of Exchange would always check for key three by turn seven. Doesn't mean that it would win at the start of turn eight. It just meant that you're checking for key three. And if you were not checking for key three at the end of turn seven, you were too slow. And I think we all agreed that that was a much different definition of like a fast game compared to anything in the sets prior to that. And so like we were interested, like, do we think that checking for key three by turn seven, rather like in our definition here of the poll that you made, a turn eight turn game, is that too fast? Is that just right? And what do we find? Like you said, ideal. Like we can define it any way we want. Like, is it something that you enjoy as a player? Is it something that you think is competitively fair? Like, what is the length of game that you think would be ideal in the sense that you're still enjoying the game, you're not feeling like it's dragging on, but you also feel like you're able to compete and that it's still a game and it's not just kind of been decided for, a long time before you get to the actual official conclusion.
Absolutely. And this is not to like throw shade on folks who enjoy a shorter game or a longer game. I myself very much enjoy the grind fests. I love throwing down some longer games and pulling things out. But from a design standpoint, I have to wonder, or you have to think that there's probably some sort of sweet spot. You imagine a distribution of game lengths that get seen in the wild. Maybe there is a nice peak somewhere, and maybe there's some outliers, but um, that peak that you're maybe designing for, there's some trade-offs, right? There's sort of an excitement to a shorter game, like, oh, these things are happening quickly. Like, what's going to happen? How's it going to resolve? And it's very fast and exciting. And then there's sort of this tension with the lack of agency. Okay, as we speed things up, maybe I have less room to respond or pull answers out of my deck, right? There are fewer turns for me to like put together a response to a very quick assault. On the flip side, games go out longer. Okay, maybe there's some room for some strategic depth to shine through in the game and how things are
Hmm.
playing out. But does the game still feel like it has some element of inertia that's bringing it towards a conclusion, or are you just kind of fatiguing your players? And so there's kind of these trade-offs on either end, and I believe sort of a sweet spot. Now, the sweet spot is maybe something that's idealized, right, to us, and maybe even to each individual. And then there's also kind of the reality, like what are we seeing? What are the kind of game lengths that we're seeing in practice? But for me, I think as we're talking about ideal, yes, it's one that strikes a nice balance between those trade-offs on either end, provides enough excitement without taking away your kind of a sense of agency and ability to impact the outcome of the game, while at the same time, going long enough to feel like there's room for you to put together a strategic plan and not just kind of always be shooting from the hip without kind of fatiguing your players, right? That's kind of the balance what I'm trying to like tease out here. And then yeah, of course, are we there, and is that kind of matching up with how folks are looking at the game today, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you used the term inertia, and you had an image screenshot up when you started the show here for those watching on Twitch of a Mark Rosewater article, 10 things every game needs. And number five on his list was inertia, which he meant something in your game that moves it along towards completion. And I thought a really cool quote in there was a well-crafted game should end before the player wants to stop playing. And
Hmm.
so if you have someone who's been playing a game of Keyforge for 25 turns, they might feel it. They're probably starting to feel at that point, like I have other things I could be doing besides, finishing this game. I think a lot of people really, especially early on in Keyforge, really grappled on because it was like a fast, quick paced game, like as opposed to other TCGs that might take like an hour for a game where you could finish Keyforge games early on in like 20 minutes sometimes. So 25 it was a long game. So like thinking about it in terms of time, yes, but also turns, because turns are more mechanically tied to this game. Where if you have a number of turns, maybe you assume you play like 3 cards a turn, and that would put you at like about 12 turns before you see your entire deck. And so I think that kind of context is important in this discussion because we're not just thinking about time. It's actually time is probably secondary in this conversation about how long should a game last because we want to look at this from like the design standpoint and from the strategic standpoint of like do you have the ability to have interplay against your opponent for, like, having time to see all the cards that you need, for example, or having the agency to make decisions that impact the game. And we've talked before in the show, like if you have a shorter game, say like 5 turns, one player might only see, 10 or 12 cards in their deck over that time. And they may not even have the ability at all to respond because the cards they need are in the bottom 2/3 of their deck. So we're really focused on that part of it, of being able to still have a competitive game with some back and forth to showcase some player skill. How many turns in a game is too few to do that? How many turns is too many where it just doesn't have the return on value and return on investment anymore? And kind of just what do people just want subjectively? Like what do they say? Like yeah, like to me, this is how many turns is about right for me.
Let's push on that too long idea since we're kind of here with this inertia concept. I'm kind of making up this number, right? Like I feel like most games of Keyforge, if they go on past the point where you flipped your deck twice, it's maybe you're sort of like, ooh, is there still that element of inertia pushing this game forward? And like, okay, yeah, I get it. Like when we're talking about tokens, hiding some cards for you on subsequent passes and this and that, like this gets thrown out the window a little bit. But ignoring that and ignoring kind of the self discarding from my deck strategies that you'd see in Grim Reminders, when you've reached a certain number of turns where you're now starting to see each of the cards in your deck for a third time, I'm like, yeah, maybe it doesn't feel like there is that element of inertia in general anymore. And so to me, that happens right around the like 18 to 20 mark. So if you have a lot of games in like the 18 to 20 turn mark, this is where I'm starting to think like, oof, maybe this is a little bit longer or somewhere on the outlier. And I do say this as a person who like loves to play those grindy decks that drag the games out. But again, we're talking broad strokes. That's kind of where my mind's at, and that's kind of where my head would be at as a designer making cards for the game. Right? I'd be thinking like, I want to be making cards that are closing out the game, kind of before we get to that like third time through the deck.
20 turns about lines up with my thoughts too. I think there's also a difference, like you mentioned, Grim Reminders, milling cards, Winds of Exchange, tokenizing cards. You don't really see them per se. I also think that there's a distinction between older Logos decks that have a lot of archiving and drawing that will get you there faster, whereas a deck with zero efficiency, maybe you're literally seeing and having the choice to play or discard every one of those without having the ability to archive a bunch until you're set up. So I think there are definitely like some asterisks we could put into this, but I think if you're playing past the second shuffle and you don't have a lot of ability to archive key pieces, if you're really just playing like a low F deck where you're just like getting through the cards and you're still not getting close enough to completion, or neither player's getting close enough, that might be the point where it's too long. Yeah, but if you still have some agency to say like, okay, I'm going to archive this to make sure that I have this right at the right time. Maybe you want to make a bunch of creatures on the board as soon as they use their only board wipe. And so you could maybe archive a bunch of creatures from one house, and then as soon as they get rid of their gateway to dis, you just drop them all. So
Mhm.
that kind of thing could be a strategy to give you some agency that will push the game towards completion. That is not just like, well, I'm playing my cards, but I'm not getting any closer to winning.
And it's funny. I can't think of very many decks that fall into this camp consistently, into this bucket consistently, right? Like, yes, there's Heart of the Forest, and I think this bullet point in Rosewater's article, number 5 on inertia, is a prime indicator of why Heart of the Forest is maybe an interesting design, but not necessarily a fun design or one that's like good for the game, done too often. But aside from that, you've maybe got some Shatterstorm recursion type shenanigans, maybe some decks that are gonna replay Ceaseforge over and over. But
Hmm.
even those, I think, that we've seen have traditionally had other tools to close games out. I don't see too many that happen here, so it's not one that I worried about as much, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, for me, like I don't personally love the long games, but I've had literally a 44 turn game before, and I loved every second of it because it just really felt like a matchup where your decisions mattered. And yeah, it took a long time to get there, and not every person would have enjoyed that. There could be a lot of 44 turn games that I would hate, but this is one that I happen to enjoy just because it did feel like I had that ability to influence the outcome and I was working towards a conclusion or a tipping point, really. But that was an exception for me. I do think that in general, I don't like anything over 20, but that's personal taste. You know, like everyone's going to be a little bit different. Maybe other people are okay with that, and maybe other people say like 15 is too many. Maybe some people say 25. So we know this is like a subjective thing, and that's kind of what we were interested in hearing about as far as like what's ideal for you. And so I guess we could either talk about like what's too short, or we can kind of go into what some of the poll results kind of indicated. Which way do you want to go first?
Let's let's go into kind of too short and maybe talk about what sorts of things start to break down from like a design and a gameplay standpoint when games are running shorter. So I I love to play. I enjoy games, Keyforge games, when it feels like I'm playing small ball, right? Or when like singles, the stolen bases,
Hmm.
like matter, right? And it's not just home run derby. Uh, and I think once you start getting into the like 5 turn, 6 turn game range, the singles, the stolen bases, they like get washed away. They kind of get like washed out as background noise against some of the big swings, right?
DT's like small ball.
DT is definitely small ball. It's definitely small ball.
You definitely want to like, you have some decisions to make that are going to, be important, like how you use your limited creature controller, how much you're going to fight, like that kind of stuff. The incremental advantage I think is great. And yeah, like I played some games where I was playing kind of a fun deck, and I would be matched up against a Grim Reminders Archon tier deck, and the game be over in 6 turns, and I had seen, like 12 cards maybe, because like sometimes when you're behind early on and they have like a runaway board or something, you just need to be like, well, I'm just going to play a board wipe and do nothing else this turn. And so you might see fewer cards. I've had games where I don't see like 25 cards from my deck and I lose. And that's not a good feeling because I don't feel like I actually had an ability to impact that game. I had no way of drawing more cards, playing more cards, doing anything. And that's why I do think it's important that the games are able to last long enough that both players have the ability to influence the outcome. And sure, like draws are going to happen. Like sometimes maybe someone draws really well, but I think what we've seen with a lot of the best Winds of Exchange and Grim Reminder sets is that they are able to accelerate to the end game way faster than prior sets could.
So this is an interesting question for you, Quick Draw. Do you feel like you should be able to see all of the cards in your deck in a typical game, or are you okay at like you get to the end of the game? I saw only 75% of my deck, but this still feels like a good still feels like a good showing. Good showing from the deck. Still feels like it was a reasonable game.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you need to see everyone. I think it's good to have some variance in that. Like, you
Hmm.
don't want to say like you get to see every single card, and if like you can't win until your opponent sees every card, something like that. I wouldn't want that. I want that variance. I think good games have a little bit of chance and luck involved in them, just like Keyforge does. So I'm not going to say that yeah you need to see every card, but you need to at least have the ability to make some decisions that will extend the game to the point where you can see more of your answers.
Totally. I don't know. I go back and forth on this. I think, and as we're homing in on kind of how we feel about our kind of idealized game length, I feel like my sweet spot is sort of in the 75 to 125% of my deck. I like that variance baked in. That's not too hot, not too cold, just right. Where yeah, maybe I didn't see the last 8 cards, or maybe I saw just the right 8 cards on a flip, and that made all the difference. So I think there is kind of a sweet spot there, and yeah, this maybe is a great time to kind of start transitioning into some of the data that we saw. But as you're thinking about, typical games, how quickly you move through your deck. If you'd imagine, yeah, I draw 3 cards a turn, play draw 3 cards a turn, what have you. With the starting 6, that puts you at roughly 10 redraws until a flip, right? So I looked back on some of my old game logs. Kind of had been saving game logs for a while, and I stopped a decent time ago. It was actually might have actually been pre Winds of Exchange. So I don't know how recent the data is, um, but I saw that my redraws were happening primarily in the turn like 8 to 11 range.
Hmm.
A few in the like 7, a few in the 11, but it was very consistent. The like 8 to 11. That's when we flip the deck and start going over to the next one, and even more heavily clustered. 8 was a little bit of a on the lower end, so it was in the like 9 to 11 range.
Hmm.
So really, that like 9 to 11 range was kind of a sweet spot for the decks that I was playing. Right. Granted, this is like a very biased sample, but that gave me sort of like an anchoring point as I'm thinking about game length. A little bit shorter than that. Yeah, cool. I'm not seeing quite everything. A little bit longer. Yeah, I'm seeing some things again, but it's not everything again. And that was kind of where I started to anchor some of my thinking on like how I feel like this should play out.
It's interesting that you track that, and I think it's really good information and data to track because every deck's going to be different. You're going to have some decks that are going to flip by turn 7, but having that perspective to say like, yeah, I'm playing a deck that's going to take me 11 turns to flip it is interesting because if you're on turn 5 or 6 and you're not even halfway through your deck, you might realize like I'm not making the pace I normally do, and perhaps I need to see more of my answers or play more of my cards, or I'm not going to find those answers. And having an understanding of how your deck normally performs and what pace you're on within a game, I think could give you some interesting strategies and things to consider as you progress through the game. Not that you always want to be going towards that goal, but I think just it's really interesting that you track that. Like I never would have thought to track like how many turns does it take me to shuffle, but now that you mention it, I think that's a great data point. I think it's a great thing to think about when you're thinking of perspective of like how many more turns is this game going to last? Am I going to be able to see the bottom of my deck by the time that comes up?
Not to diminish myself in your eyes too much, but what I actually saved was just the game logs themselves from TCO. And then it was very easy to pull out the turn that reshuffles and deck flips happened. So I had the whole like game log in entirety just saved for a whole bunch of games.
You say not to diminish myself here, and what you ended up saying was like, well, I actually recorded everything.
I didn't have the foresight for this specifically, but had it all the data, all the raw data saved. But also, was able to then get how long did those games go and get kind of a distribution from that too, which was kind of fun to look back at. So
Yeah.
I can pull that up. And big shout out to Zenzi Zenzik, who's been putting together a reboot of the Crucible tracker, which is really exciting to see. And they had about 100 games or so of data to pull for us that we'll take a look at too.
I,
But
I actually I think no, I don't want to like do a disservice to what Zenzi's doing. I wouldn't even call it a remake of the tracker. I would say it's a totally different thing. It is the same concept in general where you can look back at your game logs, but they've been including so many interesting pieces of data from those games and extracting that. It's been very cool to see the progress. They're building it they're building it personally, but they're sharing a lot of information in our server on Discord. So if you want to check it out, come visit our server. There's a channel for it and kind of see the progress that they're making on that. It's very cool.
yeah, very cool to see. And they were nice enough to share some of the aggregate data from games that have been tracked while they're kind of doing the initial testing here. And I have that. I guess I can show it real quick on stream. Thank you very much, Zenzi for allowing us to share this with folks. Kudos to you. And we're looking at kind of just frequency of turn counts that were achieved over the tracked games. And I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that we are counting sides if we're taking the baseball analogy as opposed to full innings. So I take a turn, you take a turn, I have turn 1, you have the second turn of the game, even though it's both of our turn 1s. Does that make sense? So when we see 20 on this chart, that is actually the 10th full turn, as it were. So a big spike in the 16 to 20 range, which would be turns 8 to 10.
And this is again saying that the game ends on
Ended
those turns, right? So
on those turns.
if you check for key 3 on turn 7, you forge key 3 on turn 8. That's an 8-turn game, even if you didn't play your 8th turn.
Right. The game ended on the 8th turn. So either somebody forged their final key at the start of turn 8, meaning they effectively did all of their racing through turn 7 and then won on the 8th turn, or they managed a key cheat on the 8th turn, that sort of a thing.
I wonder if these count early concedes, because there is one there that looks to be about turn 6, which is, 6 turns played, so turn 3. That would be an interesting game there. And
Yeah,
then the
yeah.
other end of the spectrum, there is one that's like 36, 37 turns played, so it would be like 18 or 19, is approaching what we consider to be probably almost too long at that point.
Yeah. And yeah, sorry, Zog. Don't have tons of insights into where these games are pulled from. I can tell you a little bit more about mine. Think of this as, I guess, a grab bag, but primarily clustered, I believe, on a couple players who are doing the testing of their tracker. I have some of my own. I'll share that as well too. Again, I do love playing some decks that are a little bit grindier, and these numbers are again largely pre-woe. So you're seeing, Zyger in its full glory, dragging things out to the bitter end, and I am counting full innings here, not sides. So that 21 turn game is a true 21 turn game for both players, right? But big spike on 10. These games, the ones that I saved logs for, are typically league matches as opposed to random matches on the competitive queue, so things like NKFL, that sort of a thing. And I've got a decent spike in the sort of 10 to 13 range, and then things kind of dropping off outside of that.
Mhm.
And again, this is kind of some older data, but kind of where I was at and what kind of anchored me there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So can we go over to what people thought was ideal for them? Want to look at that data?
Yeah, so we just kind of walk through some of what we had been seeing in the wild from our own games that have been tracked, and we also wanted to ask folks just gut check, like, what do you think ought to be how long games last in turns. This is a racing game, so your speed at which you're racing is kind of keys per turn, I guess. I don't know, and the person who could do 3 keys fastest measured in turns is going to win. Uh, and we asked folks how many turns that ought to take. We saw a huge spike, so I guess let's not like oversell this. We sent the survey out a couple days ago. We've got I think 20 responses so far. 20
Yep.
responses so far. Of those 20 responses, 9 folks said 10 turns was the number for them. And then 9 and 11 had 3 responses each. 12 got 2, and the rest got 1. And one blessed soul out there said it should take 18 plus. And oh, geez, why did I agree to play against JT Russell? And there were a lot of actually very kind of insightful and interesting comments. We left some free form comments for folks to kind of chime in on, give some context on what they were thinking. It was left intentionally open ended and vague, and folks had a chance to kind of let us know what they were thinking too. And
Hmm.
we're trying to incorporate that in the discussion, but we're obviously not going to step through.
Numerically, though, like the takeaway is that people hovered around 10. 10 plus or minus 2 was, I would say, the vast majority of these responses. A couple outliers, one at 6 and one at 18. But for the most part, 10 turns is where people landed for how long a typical game of Keyforge should last. And I was one of those people that voted 10. I think 10 just kind of seemed like the standard to me. It's, early on in the game, 10 turns was, a pretty normal, I would say, maybe on the slightly fast end, unless you're playing rush decks, which would go slightly faster than that. But 10 feels good to me. 10 feels like you have enough chance to draw your cards and make some decisions. If we're going by about 3 cards a turn, you're seeing more than 75% of your deck, which was the benchmark that you had made. And so I think the general consensus among players is somewhere around 10, 8 to 12, we could say, focused on
Mhm.
10.
Yeah, and thinking practically, like bringing the game mechanics kind of into the picture, 10 turns, if you're kind of spreading things out, right, means that you got to call every house at least 3 times if you wanted to, right? So, getting back to where things break down in shorter numbers, right? A 5 turn game, one of those houses at least, you did not get to use the cards that you played. And for the other two, assuming you spread everything out evenly, like if you wanted to use a card played like reap with a creature, action, fight, or use an artifact, right, it had to be in your hand the first time you called that house, meaning that you had to like if your answer to the thing that your opponent is doing is a thing that has to be on board and get used, it had to be drawn the first time by the first time you called a particular house, which is just a really high bar, right? That's a high bar, and that's kind of what drove me towards more like this 10 number, which is like, yeah, we're gonna get a chance to play or use things at least for 2 turns after having called it a first time. 10 is again right around that sweet spot of when folks are typically flipping over a deck. So, you're going to be finding answers often, hopefully in time, but, maybe not always. There's still room for variance. I went with 10 as well. And my kind of answer was driven largely by when decks tend to flip over and wanting to have enough room to like find the cards that I need to play and use before the game's over.
Yeah, so we're on the same page there. I think an extension of this then, or like rather, the next logical question is thinking about if a game should last about 10 turns. We've talked a lot in the past about early game, middle game, late game, and kind of different strategies involved. I believe it was episode 49 where we talked about that. And I think this also gives a good frame of reference for where you would put those turns, where you would put those kind of phases of the game and how you're playing in each of those turns. And so, if you expect a game to last about 10 turns, and just having that knowledge, like, yeah, this game and this matchup, 10, 12 turns maybe it should go, knowing when to pivot, which turn is like, okay, I need to start making my move to the middle game, or I need to maybe start making my move to close this one out. Otherwise, I'm just not going to be able to get across the finish line first. So, do you think about the early, middle, and late game in the context of the number of turns like this now?
I don't know that I put it in those buckets specifically, but I think they do map. I find myself counting turns very often when I'm in the like 7 to 10 turn range, and I mean counting turns ahead to like, oh gosh, my opponent is going to win in 3 turns given what's on board and what I know they're about to draw. Uh, and then mapping back like what I need to do, what needs to happen from my end to make sure I either win first or stop them from doing that thing. And like I think that's, almost certainly a like end game mentality, right? Kind of what we were talking about in that episode. And like, yeah, measuring out who's got how much gas left, and then can I make it over the finish line before I run out of gas, or make you run out of gas. So in my mind, that's definitely in the like end game phase, and tends to happen when we're 2 to 3 turns from a player winning, or presenting a winning threat. So absolutely, you were kind of in like the end game at that point. Early
Mhm.
and middle, I guess, are a little bit looser to me, but I don't know. How do you kind of see them in those some same ways?
If I had to put, I was thinking about putting numbers on them. Like early game, I'd say like is 2 to 3 turns, depending on how many cards you see and which houses you call early on. But you're trying to like set up like that. And middle game would be like 3 to 4 turns after that, maybe 5 turns, and then the end game could be anywhere from 2 to 3 turns, maybe 2 to 4 turns. If you misjudge how long it's going to take you. And so I think, yeah, I mean, I'd kind of loosely define it like that. But I think the other thing I think of here is that you talk about how a 5 or 6 turn game you don't get to see enough. If we think about that in the context of the phases of the game, a 5 turn game doesn't really have the ability to have a real early game, mid game, and end game. You're really just like all gas, start to finish. It's over before you even realize it. And I think not having those phases appear in the game really takes the skill out, because I think a good game, and I think a good game of Keyforge should have each of those 3 phases, because there are different strategies and different ways to approach it as a player. You could be a very good early game player and maybe not a great end game player, or vice versa. Or maybe you are a very good middle game player, but you struggle with the bookends. And I think if you have a short enough game that doesn't have these defined phases, you're not really testing yourself as a player in all aspects that you could be. And so I
Mm.
want a game that's long enough that's going to test all 3 of these different skills of being able to play in the early, the middle, and the end game.
I like that a lot, with some caveats. So I like the idea that there can exist decks that try and break that system a little bit, but they should have a downside, right? There should be
Yeah.
there should be some sort of drawback. It shouldn't be a deck that can put out must answer threats turns 1 through 3, and then also have gas for the late game, and a strong middle game too, and all kind of the elements that go along with it. So looking at something like Rector, like here we go, season 3 starting off right, talking about Rector right off the bat. But like one of the things that it does really well is it has a high density of witches, right? Like lots of really, really good first turn plays that you kind of need to answer, or you get buried in advantage. And that's uncomfortable for a lot of decks because they need to deviate from their like early game setup plan just to kind of answer threats, right? But Rector is an incredible deck with some holes, right? And that's part of its charm. But I think that's a healthy kind of way for a deck like that to be. Similar, like you think about your prototypical Coda Rush decks. Like I think, yeah, getting kind of those rush strategies as part of the mix is healthy and great. But they shouldn't have everything else to go with them too. Like maybe the high density of rush means you don't have room for the board control and the artifact control and all these other things, and so you're left a little bit vulnerable.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think in broad strokes I'm with you on there for sure.
Yeah, and I don't have a problem with those decks existing either that try to shorten the game, and understanding as a player who is up against a rush deck, am I a good enough early game player to recognize what I have to do in these first 3 turns to prevent them from shortening this game to the point where I'm going
Mm.
to lose? And so I have no problem with those decks existing. I want there to be counterplay to be able to do something about it in time, whether that is maybe playing some creatures that capture that they can't handle, because like you mentioned, maybe the rush deck doesn't have a lot of creature control, or maybe it's control the weakening them early on into something that they don't want to go to, knowing that it's not going to advance their game plan. So those kind of early game strategies, I think, are things that I would want to focus on. Whereas, again, if we think about like the more modern sets with Grim Reminders, there's a lot of times where a Grim Reminders deck, it's just like double boo and Winds of Death, and all of a sudden they have their entire deck, and you have nothing, and there's not a lot of counterplay you can do there. And so there's different types of these short games that I think make a difference too. And Yeah. Well, I know we don't want to get too much into this, but I will just say succinctly that power creep makes a difference in this conversation as well.
Yeah, and there's no denying that, having gone through a number of competitive games with Grim Reminders and seeing, these games that are ending on turn 5 or turn 6, fairly consistently, inspired this conversation or this kind of like exercise. But yeah, I don't know. It's been rewarding to think about. I I definitely feel like there has been this like edging forward, and that's maybe a natural thing to see gone unchecked in a racing game with more and more sets added to the mix. But I yeah would reiterate that I like, and this is a comment that was consistent in the survey that we sent out. Folks would say, "I put 10 turns because," or "I put 8 turns, but." Or 7 turns, but I just want there to feel like there's room for play and counterplay, and like meaningful kind of like threat and response, uh, as opposed to like someone running away. And like a 10 turn game felt like there was room for nice play and counterplay without the feeling like somebody ran away with it. And that's kind of where folks landed. So a big it depends, of course, but yeah, that being at the crux of it. And then I think with the others, I feel comfortable with sort of that like 9 to 11 range as sort of a nice sweet spot to wrap a bow on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Now we did say that this wasn't going to be like time driven. We weren't worried about that at all. But there are practical like limitations in a competitive tournament setting too, right? Like we had a note in the chat. I don't know if this was tongue in cheek or not, but 2 hours is too long. Like maybe, I guess depends on your taste. But in like a tournament setting, you're given 45 minutes. 45 minutes? Yeah.
Yeah.
And
45.
not 2 hours? Are you sure? I don't know. And like if you just start thinking about like, well, it takes 1 or 2 minutes, 3 minutes per turn, 2 to 3 minutes per turn per person to like kind of think through a complex turn. Maybe on average too. I'm not sure. That'd be interesting to kind of dig into. But you start to run into some hard limits. Like 20 turn games are maybe a thing that I would personally enjoy, especially if there are tiers involved. But it's not going to be like something that I can reasonably achieve and then still like finish the game in a tournament setting. So there are some limitations there, but I think 10 puts you kind of in like a reasonable spot to be finishing games without worrying about going to time often too, which is nice. The Holy Grail has always been like a best of 3, right? But I don't think 10 puts you kind of in that range. But 1 in 45 certainly feels achievable. Achievable.
Yeah. Yeah, and the time part of it gets kind of mixed up a bit too because there are definitely some decks that take longer to play their turns than others.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
it's not a one-to-one correlation of, number of turns, number of minutes is always going to match up, but um, you can definitely have a game that's 5 turns that feels like it's too long. And you can have a game that's 20 turns that feels like it went by really quickly. And I just want to clarify the comment from the chat earlier. It was Ketzer that said, "I think if a game of Keyforge goes past 2 hours, it's starting to get a little bit too long." So don't want to twist their words. 2 hours, it's starting to get like, oh, well, maybe this is too long. I'm not so sure. But someone else had mentioned that I forget where it was, somewhere on Discord maybe today, said that they had a game that lasted, 25 or 35 turns or whatever it was. And I guess it was just a lot longer than they had expected. And I kind of was like, hey, just look at that as like free Keyforge. You get to play more Keyforge for a single game. Like we all enjoy this game, so who cares if you're playing longer? This is what we're doing for fun. We should be enjoying this.
You are getting high value for your game start button presses on
Yeah.
TCO.
Yes. The amount of entertainment for a single game is increased. That ratio increases when you have a 35 turn game.
Yeah. Do you put time limits on your matches on TCO for leagues and such, or do you just kind of
I
let
generally
it fly?
don't. Yeah, I just let it fly. I've had a couple situations where it went too long. Almost always because it is a grind deck versus a grind deck. I tend to play a lot of rush decks, so like those kind of matchups don't happen for me very often. Like I mentioned that 44 turn game I had, I think it was in Kagi. That was a heck of a match, but there was no timer on that one. There probably should have been.
I remember this match. You started it. I went out to dinner, like brought the whole family,
Yeah.
uh, and
Murph went camping for the weekend.
yeah, Murph went camping for the weekend, and Murph came back, and you were still
Yeah,
playing.
that's true. That is true. It was a really crazy match. Yeah. There were a lot of people that came and went during that match. They're like, "Wait a minute, this is the same match?"
This is it. Okay, joking aside with Murph, I legitimately went out to dinner, like, I don't know, went to a movie, something like all like back to back, and came back and it was still going.
I'm
Uh,
I'm just glad that I was against someone who was enjoying it as much as I was.
I mean, so they say, but so they
So
say.
they say.
So they say. Was the first game the longest, or was it
No, it
a
was game
different one?
3 because it was a
Okay.
matchup where, there was definitely a tipping point, and I bid a pretty high number of chains on the favored deck,
Mm,
knowing that it had good efficiency with, like, an autoencoder, it had some things like Effervescent Principle to extend the game, and I knew after the first 2 games that there was a tipping point where the deck couldn't lose, basically, and, it was still a very technical execution that had to happen after that tipping point, but, I knew as long as I did it correctly, I would have it, and that's pretty much what happened. It just happened to take 45 turns, 44 turns.
Could you man, what an emotional beating if game 1 goes to, like, 45 turns and you're like, "Best of 3, baby, let's go."
I have to check. I think I did save those game logs because they were all 3 pretty
Oh,
remarkable, but I think 1 and 2 were, like, 20 to 30 turns.
incredible. So you were hitting, like the last one was, like, 40 turns and the others were 20, so you're, like, at 80 plus turns
Oh,
of
yeah.
Keyforge for
Over the
this
course of the
match.
match, it was easily over 80. Yeah.
Oofa doofa. Oofa doofa. That's something. That's
Good time.
beautiful. Yeah, and chat saying that, like, I wonder about this too, is, like, mental stamina thing you consider conserving. Like, I brought T-Zyger, the Lighthouse Dock, a deck that I love and enjoy, absolutely a grind deck, has grueling turns start to finish, and, I brought that deck to, Vault Tour Philadelphia, had 2 games that went to time. Actually, one finished just as time was being called. The other went to time, and it was a very different experience playing that in a competitive setting online and versus in real life. And so I kind of kicking myself afterwards for not having more competitive games, IRL with that deck under my belt
Mhm.
before bringing it. But be that as it may, do you definitely feel, or I definitely felt the kind of mental fatigue in the latter rounds with that.
Yeah.
But
That's a really good point too, is when you're playing in those longer premier level events, you wanna bring something that you are comfortable playing for 4, 5, 6 hours straight. And if it's a very mentally taxing deck, that's gonna be harder on you. And if it's something that's gonna consistently go to time, that's also very hard. I mean, I think they do a pretty good job at Vault Tours giving lunch breaks, um,
mhm.
which is nice, but there's still a lot to be said about, like, finishing your game in 20, 25 minutes and having a break between rounds just to stretch your legs, walk around a little bit. It makes a big difference for sure. And so I actually do tend to gravitate towards the rush decks, even if I still like very strategically complex ones.
Mhm.
But I at those kind of events, I definitely value the time between rounds. It's definitely a real advantage.
Yeah, I can agree with that. When I'm playing a faster deck, like I played a much faster, very rushy deck at the last Fall Tour we were at, and on that day, it was kind of like, oh, lunch break, but we've got so much time, because my games were ending quickly.
Mhm.
But playing Zyger, you feel like you're running the gauntlet. You finish one game, and like everybody was like, "Is this guy done yet?" You're like, "All right, next game. Where's the table?" Like, "All right, let's go." You
Yeah,
know. So it's a very different experience on the day, for sure.
yeah.
Yeah. But that's interesting. So there are, I mean, yeah, there are kind of like practical limitations. These I think are going to influence how the designers have to, or kind of like forced into thinking about ideal game lengths that they're designing for. I think hopefully 10 is on the inside of that, but there are absolutely going to be. I've played games with Zyger that I feel like you get to the 10th turn and you're like, oh mama, this is like there's been a lot that's happened already. And like that's okay. It's just, as you're looking at lots of decks over lots of games, I think 10 is a kind of a reasonable sweet spot in a competitive setting. Well, cool. I think maybe we've hit that pretty hard. Let's talk a little bit about what do we kind of do with that info? So does it help us much to think to like have this in mind, like, oh, 10's the ideal game. I should probably feel bad about myself if it's turn 11 now. Like, no, but I think being mindful or knowing how your deck tends to pace itself is very useful and can be super helpful for you in planning, especially as you're nearing the end game, or kind of working through the middle game, right? Like, oh gosh, do I need to hold? It's turn, 5 or whatever. I'm halfway through my deck. Maybe you don't know the exact turn number, but like, do I need to hold this card that's potentially an answer, or can I like hope to get it on the redraw? That sort of a thing. And
Hmm.
so, just being aware of where you are in your deck and how the game is progressing pacing wise. Is very useful information. It doesn't mean you need to like worry about the turn number per se, but like being aware of how you're moving through your deck and how the cards are flowing, I think is definitely a thing to be aware of. Yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned like maybe there's a card that you hope to get on a redraw, but like if you're on turn 5 and you recognize that your deck usually ends games by turn 9 or loses by turn 9, your opponent's
Hmm.
making pretty good pace, and you think I'll just discard this and hope to redraw it, you may not even be able to get to the shuffle. And so recognizing where you are in the game, how many turns are left, and how many turns it's taken you, like that can definitely be, I think, valuable strategic information to inform you during a game and maybe use this kind of information to become a better player to understand like, yeah, I can't bank on redrawing this because I can't even bank on shuffling. So that might
Yep.
be an indicator that this is a card I need to hold.
Yep. Knowing whether or not you're going to shuffle, and maybe even like recognizing when you're up against a rush deck and you'd normally get a reshuffle, but you're not going to in this game. Yeah. This happens. I keep bringing Zyger up, but um, the misplays that I most often make with that deck are and what I name with Eaton's Jar, right?
Mm,
And so I make a decision early on if I draw the card early and kind of want to get it out there. Is this game going to go super long and I need to kind of position myself with Jar for a winning endgame, or am I using this more for tempo and trying to like win earlier and sacrifice some of that endgame edge, right? And most of the time when I lose with that deck, I look back in the game and I say, yeah, I misevaluated where we were going and how the game was pacing. I really needed this Jar to be a tempo boost early on so that I could close the game out, or like, yeah, I thought I was going to close the game out, but I didn't get there, and I would have had an opportunity to like turn the corner in the end game if I had jarred their end game piece.
you mentioned tempo a few times. I'm trying to think. We haven't done an episode on tempo yet, have we?
I'll put it on the list.
I
Put it
think it
on
is
the
on the
list.
list. I think
It's
it
on
might
the
be
list.
coming. I think it is. But this is definitely relevant to that too, like tempo and number of turns in a game and how many you expect to be left, that kind of thing. And you make these decisions based on that. And I think understanding the length of game, maybe this is a good precursor to that discussion on tempo, where we're thinking about like how do you have this frame of reference for a game? Sure, it's turns, but do we really think about turns that much? Like I never actually thought that much to track how many turns are in a game for some of my decks or how many turns it takes me to flip my deck, things like that. But I think starting to think in that context might give you a better frame of reference for the kind of tempo that you should be thinking about to see where you're at in a game if you're falling behind or if you're well ahead.
Totally. And I mean, before kind of digging into this topic, it wasn't a thing that I had paid too much heed to, which is incredible, right? Like we're playing, it's billed as a racing game, right? How quickly can you forge three keys? And quickly is measured in turns, right? If I can do it in fewer turns than you can, I win. But just because we're kind of racing side by side, we never, or I never, very very infrequently look back at exactly how many turns it was. It's just kind of like, yeah, did I see you ahead of me or behind me when
Hmm.
the game ended? But having an understanding for how those turns typically play out, or how many turns typically get played, is good information. And I think really became really became kind of obviously apparent. I don't know, redundantly obviously apparent in the WoW era when that like 7 turn mark just became such a stark divide, at
Hmm.
least to the decks that I was testing and trying, and now it feels more like 5 or 6.
Yeah. I guess let's start the Mario Kart references early in the season. But, you talked about, like, you don't count the turns because all you're worried about is, "Am I winning or losing?" Right? Think about, like, if you're in a race, any kind of race, but let's say a Mario Kart race. You may not care about, like, your time, right? Like, I finished this course in, 3 minutes, 5 seconds. Okay, like, you don't care about that. You only care if you're winning or losing that race, and you win the race, and you're like, "Cool, the race is over, doesn't matter how fast it was." But if you understand how much time it takes you to get through a certain course, then you're going to be able to better pace yourself against someone else who goes ahead early and you're like, man, they're like 10 seconds ahead of me this lap. I might need to take some shortcuts to get to where I need to be to win this race and that positioning. And if you think about like that, the time aspect of a race, it's very akin to the turn aspect in Keyforge, where you're thinking like, I'm falling behind here, and so in order to catch up, I need these shortcuts. Otherwise, I'm like 2 turns behind them right now, and you have to make some decisions based on that. So it's kind of the same. Like you wouldn't really, you wouldn't ignore times in a race. Why would you ignore turns in a game of Keyforge?
And I'm so glad that you presented that kind of in reference to how you react to the other player, because I think there is a trap in thinking about turns in an absolute sense to kind of getting yourself into this kind of solitaire like mindset. But if you're using that information to gauge your pacing against your opponent, I think that's a great way to kind of interact with the game. Yeah, totally. Well, the chat is teeing us up for that tempo episode you hinted at, but we won't go there quite yet. Excited that folks are interested, I guess. Though I don't know if I had too many other notes to hit on this one. Quick draw. Did you have anything you wanted to touch on?
I don't think so, but the tempo one will be good. Maybe a month, 6 weeks out. Looking for that
Yeah,
one. Gonna let it brew a little bit. Hopefully, this kind of gives you something to think about before that episode does come out.
right on.
I think I hit everything here, though. Just a shout out to BHawk. BHawk gave us some interesting notes before the show today as well. Kind of thinking about this, and just to kind of sort of out of left field, I guess, compared to the rest of the conversation we already had, but talking about the way Grim Reminder's efficiency works and being able to see only the cards you want to see and not really like seeing your entire deck is a really interesting thing because we're talking about this in the frame of reference of like I've seen my entire deck and I've seen every card and I've been able to use them, but Grim Reminders and the recursion that it brings with it kind of flips it on its head a bit because you're just like I'm just going to empty my discard pile and then choose what I want to see, and you could do that a lot faster and you like see every card, but you don't have to actually wade through the bad ones and play around the bad ones in those. You can just kind of pick and choose a lot of times which ones you want to bring back. And so it really changes the conversation in a not always good way. So that was, yeah, shout out to BHawk for kind of, getting us to think about things a little bit differently right
Hmm.
before we went on to record.
Oh, that Beehawk, a gentleman and a scholar, indeed. Indeed. Cool. Well, it wouldn't be a new season of Bottom of the Beaker without some brand new sponsors, folks. And this episode of Bottom of the Beaker was brought to you by Exchange Program, the hassle-free service that handles your returns with ease. Whether you've changed your mind or simply found something better, for a small monthly fee, Exchange Program sends couriers right to your door to pick up unwanted items and return them to their respective stores. No more standing in long lines or dealing with frustrating return policies. With Exchange Program, you can focus on what really matters while we take care of the rest. Simplify your life and let Exchange Program navigate the retail trading frenzy because your time is too valuable to waste. Quick draw, you ever have any things you'd like to take back? I don't know.
I love the exchange program service that they offer, and I also love to put a bunch of amber on the thing before I send it back to the store. That's my favorite move with it.
Yes, I would like to belong to the thing I'm going to load up with Amber of the Month Club, and you can ship it off with the next box.
Love it.
Yeah. Well, folks, I want to let you all know that Bottom of the Beaker is recorded once again Wednesday evenings right here at 9:30 Eastern Time at twitch.tv/sloppylabwork. You can find recordings of our other shows and past streams over at youtube.com. We are at Sloppy Labwork over there. And for the very best content, 34? No, 57 times distilled and scraped from the bottom of the beaker. You can search for that very phrase in your podcatcher of choice, and we'll be there. Regardless of how many turns the game takes you. Play some Keyforge. Thanks so much, Quick Draw, as always. And do you have any words for the folks getting off the audio stop?
Yeah, thanks for tuning in live. We had a lot of viewers live tonight. Thank you guys very much. Thanks everyone listening on the podcast. Welcome to season 3, and don't forget, most importantly, to stay sloppy.